Hello and welcome back to this reading from my book, The Seed of Yggdrasill. And we have now reached chapter 9, The Priestess and the King. And the first part of this chapter is 9.1, The Sacred Marriage Institution. And I'm going to begin by quoting a Sumerian hymn to Inanna and in honor of the sacred marriage by the oldest poet ever known to humankind, the oldest poet that had her poems written down, Enheduanna from Sumer. She was a priestess to the moon god, but she was very personally, she had sort of inherited that role. I think it was from her father. She had inherited the role of priestess of the moon god, a male moon god. But she was very, very dedicated to Inanna, and she wrote many hymns to Inanna and to the sacred marriage, the goddess Inanna, the great goddess of Sumer. And she was also one of those who identified Inanna with other goddesses from the same region, but by different people, different languages. So she identified Inanna with, for example, Ishtar. And it is true that these goddesses had different names because they came from different languages, but they were apparently very much related. And Enheduanna, the first poet ever to have her poems written down 5,000 years ago, well, she identified these goddesses. This hymn that I'm gonna quote from was written down, in translation by David Kinsley from his book from 1989, The Goddess's Mirror, Visions of the Divine from East and West. And I read. This is a poem about the sacred marriage. And the sacred marriage is when the king sort of marries the goddess of the people. She's here called the queen of the palace. And he gets his power as a king from her love. So he has to go through a ritual marriage to the goddess of the land in order to become king. And this was very common back 5,000 years ago. That's why I call it the sacred marriage institution, because institution indicates something that is very well established as a system within a culture or a religion. And I read. The people of Sumer gather in the palace, in that house which rules the land. The king builds a throne for the queen of the palace. He sits beside her on the throne. The king walks with a lifted head towards the sacred vagina. Well, they were not that shy back then. Dumuzi walks with a lifted head towards Inanna's sacred vagina. So now the king is taking the role of Dumuzi, who is the goddess's consort. So he becomes like her consort. So then he calls himself Dumuzi. So Dumuzi walks with a lifted head towards Inanna's sacred vagina. He lies down beside her on the bed. Gently he caresses her, whispers the words of love. Oh, my sacred jewel! Oh, my marvelous Inanna! Oh, my lady, queen of heaven and earth! Queen of heaven and earth! May he live long in your embrace. So this was an invocation to the Queen of Heaven and Earth, Inanna, that he, the king, may live long in her embrace, in her love. One of the oldest known and recognized human civilizations was established between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers in present-day Iraq. The area was known as Sumer from the earliest of days, and was later called Mesopotamia. From the beginning, the culture consisted of several city-states and many different deities. The cultural organization and religious concepts of Sumer appear to have had a tremendous impact on the Middle East and Europe from an early stage, particularly during the Bronze Ages. Their religion was polytheist, but the creator deity was almost always a goddess. The order of the universe happened often through sexual unions between gods and goddesses. The great goddess Ishtar was widely worshipped throughout a period of 3,000 years, despite great changes and migrations. She stood in the center of the most popular and widely spread cults and was revered as the great goddess by many Sumerians. She was primarily a goddess of war and fertility, and she was credited with establishing culture as such. She was the mother and the creator of human beings. She was increasingly worshipped as the source of all ethical qualities involved in the personal lives of her worshippers. Her name is etymologically identical with the West Semitic goddess Astarte and Athart. Around 2300 before Christ, that is almost 5,000 years ago, four and a half, the priestess and poet Enheduanna, who was the world's first known and named poet with a written legacy, identified Ishtar with another popular Semitic goddess, Inanna, the Queen of Heaven. Ishtar, Inanna, was the main character of an important ritual known as the Sacred Marriage, a ritual that dominated the official and royal cult throughout the entire Mesopotamian period, which lasted around 4,500 before Christ, that would be 6,500 years ago, until about 1,750 before Christ. And that would take us back almost 4,000 years. So this was over a period of more than 3,000 years. And that is consistency that we don't know of in later times at all. That a religious institution, set of systems and rules and beliefs survived for more than 3,000 years and more. It still survived after, but it was consistent for 3,000 years in the same region, despite the fact that there was a lot of war and upheavals and change of culture and people and languages in that region all those years. But that institution that was maintained for 3,000 years and more. So according to mythology that we know of, the first sacred marriage happened between the king Dumuzi and an avatar of Inanna, or between the king Tammuz and the goddess Ishtar. Since then, the wedding was repeated thousands of times, essential in all royal inaugurations. It may even have been a part of the annual celebration of the new year. The ritual took the form of a wedding between the king and a priestess, and this priestess would incarnate the goddess Inanna or the goddess Ishtar. And a priestess who was trained for this particular role did that. So there was a priestess who impersonated the goddess in this ritual. So there was an actual ritual marriage going on here, where a priestess was having the role of the goddess. And the king had the role of the first consort of the goddess. All the surviving literature that we have shows that it was the goddess who was the dominant partner in this marriage. She was the one who appointed the ruler and who enjoys him sexually in a very detailed vocabulary. The sexual joy of the union leads to fertile vegetation, the stability of the government, and to the king's ability to rule the country. The goddess will lead the king to victory in battle and help him maintain the social order. The marriage was celebrated publicly as a great and joyful event. The kings called themselves the grooms of the goddess. That was sort of a word for king, the goddess's groom. Or he would call himself the caretaker of the goddess. So he took care of the goddess's land. The kings ruled in her sacred name and with her blessing. The goddess was called the carrier of the king, the source of the king, and she was called his power and his prestige. The goddess was clearly seen as the source of the king's power, and it is through her love and her sexual satisfaction that his success as a king may be guaranteed. The texts that deal with the sacred marriage describe the goddess as an active sexual partner whose sexuality is unambiguously blessed and fortunate. Her sexual pleasure blesses the king and the entire society. Her sexuality is celebrated as non-monogamous and is not connected to human reproduction. The central theme of the erotically laden ritual was her power over the fertility of the land and her power over victory in war and her power over fate of society. Connected to the ritual of the sacred marriage was the annual death of the god of vegetation, who is also the king in his mythical aspect. The goddess will grieve and descend into the underworld in order to restore her lover to life. It has been speculated that the king was sacrificed and replaced during the ritual that accompanied the myth, but there is no evidence that this was actually the case. The ritual of the sacred marriage was so important and well established over so many millennia that it continued into later eras. The Babylonian era, that followed the Mesopotamian era in the same region, Babylon, and the Hebrew eras that followed after 1750 before Christ and into several centuries AD. So this ritual survived. The ritual or its basic concepts had by then long spread across the ancient world. Now, Camilla Helene Fari, the Norwegian archaeologist, ranks among the scholars who have argued that there is a considerable evidence for a cult of sacred marriage in Bronze Age Scandinavia, and that these evidently were also related to the Sumerian form. Sexual scenes abound in Bronze Age Scandinavian rock art, and are made in such a fashion and in such places that there is no doubt that the sexual scenes were connected to ritual and religion. Numerous such scenes are depicted within burials or on burial lids, and the scenes often depict public rituals surrounding the sexual scene. Bronze Age Scandinavia was not an isolated place, but powerfully connected to the rest of Europe. In fact, the whole of Europe was culturally connected at this time during the Bronze Ages. And by Bronze Ages, we are speaking of 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, until about, like 5,000 to 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, we have the Bronze Age. It began earlier, obviously, in Sumer, but it came to the north within around, it took about a millennium or more before that happened. But there was the Bronze Age culture of Scandinavia actually coexisted with older forms of culture, like the hunter-gatherer cultures. But the great, the more like civilized culture of Bronze Age Scandinavia was in touch with other societies all over Europe and into the Middle East and North Africa as well. So they got around back then too. So they had connection, Scandinavia had connection to the entire Mediterranean region and also to the Middle East. There is little doubt that the Sumerian ritual of the sacred marriage became a powerful hit in cultures as distant as the Scandinavian, as a means of legitimizing the rule of a king by symbolically marrying him to the goddess of the land or the tribe that he was to rule. We can only guess that many of the underlying concepts found in Sumerian texts may have influenced the Scandinavian version. As the Icelandic writer Svava Jakobsdóttir has pointed out, sacred marriage myths abound in Irish legends and are connected to the offering of precious mead. The goddess of the legends appear as a magical woman whose various names, are either associated with the red golden drink that they serve or with kingship and sovereignty. Only through winning her love may a young man become king. Jakobsdóttir points out several similarities between these Irish legends and the Norse, as well as a connection to the Indian myths of the Soma and the Greek myths of the nectar of immortality. During the 1950s, the Swedish scholar Folke Ström pointed out several aspects of Norse myths and sagas that may give evidence for a cult of sacred marriage in connection to kingship inauguration during the Viking Age or earlier. From the 1990s onwards, the Norwegian professor Gro Steinsland has further argued that Old Norse myths, through symbolism and initiation structures, display royal inauguration myths of sacred marriage. She has suggested that the many golden icons of a kissing couple from the Scandinavian Iron Age are in fact amulets depicting the sacred marriage. The Norwegian historian of religions, Gunhild Røthe, and Gunhild was the one who supervised my own 2004 thesis, she has shown that the Oseberg ship burial displays evidence of a cult of sacred marriage, where the two priestesses who were buried were somehow connected to this ritual. The ship burial, which took place in Vestfold, Norway, in 834 AD, contained a wealth of so-called cultic, that is religious or ceremonial equipment, including mead brewing equipment and the famous wand of the Völva. A marriage bed and various symbolic objects and carvings may, according to Røthe, suggest that the women of the Oseberg burial were priestesses or völur, who played a role during the sacred marriage. It is my own suggestion that the Oseberg women were völur, who did what völur had always done, travelled from place to place in order to offer their services. The only difference between these two women and those we meet in the sagas is the fact that these women of Oseberg travelled by ship and possessed great wealth. The extreme wealth of their grave suggests that these particular völur were royally sponsored, possibly because the greatest service they rendered was to supervise and partake in rituals of sacred marriage. At the time, Norway was a place of many small kingdoms, and the times were changeable and violent, so that the service of royal inauguration ceremonies may have been in continuous demand. It is well known that the goddess of the land was represented by a priestess during the inauguration ritual of sacred marriage in Sumer, and this was probably also the case in Scandinavia. Thus, one of the priestesses, at least, may have been a professional conductor of this sexual ritual. For many different kingdoms to employ the services of one common national priestess or group of priestesses would have been symbolic and may explain why the women were probably of foreign origin. Okay, this was written back in 2012-ish, 2011, 2012, and it was believed, so that what I'm referring to here is what they believed back then. Apparently there have been some changes in this. They don't know if the women were actually, they think maybe the one of the women may have had some Eastern European ancestry, but it's not absolutely certain. But this was written back then, so I'm just reading it. There are some indications in the DNA evidence that the women may have been Slavic in origin, which may suggest that they or their mothers had been brought to Norway as slaves from the Black Sea. But If slaves, once a woman had donned the cloak of the völva and grasped the sacred wand, the völr, her low origins meant nothing, since the völva was beyond the social order, which is possibly why the two slave-born or slave-brought girls could have ended up buried as high-ranking queens. The fact that the priestesses who conducted the sacred marriage for various different kingdoms and chiefdoms had no clan belonging in Norway may have only strengthened their role, since no particular clan could be said to be favoured above others by the goddess of the land, whom the priestess would represent during the ritual. So they were sort of they didn't have any part in any particular dynasty, which could make them more equipped to not favour one above the other. However, as said, the DNA evidence thing is not as clear as they thought back then. In a fashion, the priestess who travelled to various kingdoms to sanctify new kings of various tribes would have been like the goddess Freyja, in whose embrace all the gods and elves had found their resurrection and their way into the death-shielded island of the Ocean Lord. So, before I begin with chapter 9.2, the sacred marriage, I am going to render the poetry that I'm going to talk about from the Håvamål, where Odin goes into the underworld and meets Gunnlod and has a drink of the precious mead, the Odrerir, and then moving on to how he hung in the tree, and also how that led to the exact same scenario, meaning that the two different parts of the Håvamål are actually connected to each other and have to do with initiation. So I'm going to read that, and then I'm going to show you the video that I made back in 2010 about this subject, because in the book this video is rendered as a transcription actually. So I'm just going to show you the actual video that I did back then. So just a moment. En alna jötun ek sotta, nu meg apterum komin, fåt gatt ek þeggjandi dar. Mörgum ordum, mälta ek I min frama, I suttungssölum. Gunnlod merum gav, gullnom stoli å, drykk hins dyra mjadar. Ill idgöld let ek hana epter hafa, sins heila hugar, sin svara söfa. Rata mun, let grum som få, och grot gnaga. Yfer och under stod göttna väger, så hetta ek höftig till. Velkaups litar, hefi ek vel notit, foss frodom vant. Tvi at Odrerir nu uppkomin, og alda ves jardar. Ifi mer å, at ek væra en komin. Göttna gordum ord. Fek Gunnladar ne nytak, en goda kono, deirar lögdumk arms yfir. Ens hindra dags, gengo hrimthursar, hova råds att frägna, hova höllo I. Att bölverk I der spurdo, fan väri med böndom komin, eda häftig honom suttunger of soit. Baug eid Odin, hygg ek at unnit hafa, vad skall hans trygdom trua? Suttung sviken, han let sum bli frå, och grötta Gunnlod. Mål att fylja, fular stoli å, urdar brunni åt, så ek och thagtak, så ek och huggtak. Hlidda ek och manna mål, och frunar heirdek döma, neum rådom thögdu. Hova höllo att, hova höllo I, heirdek säga så. Rådomk der loddfafner, en du råd nemer, njuta mundu efter nemer, der mono god efter geter, vars du aul drekker, tjos du derm a jardar megin, tvi at jörd teker vid öldri, en elder vid sottom, eik vid abindi, aks vid fjölkyngi, höll vid hyrogi. Heipdom skal måna kvedja, beiti vid bitsottom, en vid bølvi runar, folk skal vid flot I taka. Veit ek at ek hekk, vinga meg de å, näter allar nio, geiri undader, och gefin odni, sjalfom mer, og dei meidi mangi veit, vars han af rotom renn. Vid hleifi mixeldo, ne vid hornegi, nystak nider, namek upp runar, öpandi nam, felek apter dadan. Fimbulljod nio namek, af enom fräga syn I bölthorn, bestlo fader, och ek dryck of gat, ens dyra mjadar, ausin odröri. Då namek frövast, och froder vera, och vaxa, och väl hafast. Ord mera vordi, ord slaitadi, verk mera verki, verk slaitadi. Runar munt du finna, och rådna stafi, mjök stora stafi, mjök stinna stafi, fådig fimbultuler, och gordo ginn regin, och reist ropter ragna. Odin med åsom, en för alfom dåin, dvalin och dvergom fyr, åsvider gyttnom fyr, ek reist själv för summa. Veist du rista skall, veist du råda skall, veist du få skall, veist du freista skall, veist du bidja skall, veist du blota skall, veist du sända skall, veist du soa skall. Bättre obedigt, än se avblotigt, ser till gildiskjov. Bättre osänt, än se avsoigt. Svå thunder omreist, fyr tjoda rök, där han upp omreis, han apter of kom. So in English, the ancient Jötun I sought, now I have returned again. Little did I get with silence there. With many words I spoke in my favor in the halls of Suttunger, heavy with drink. Gunnlöd, battle drink or battle invitation. Gunnlöd gave me, on the golden chair, a drink of precious mead. A bad repayment I let her have after, for her whole love, for her burdened soul. With the mouth of the drill I made a way for myself, and gnawed through the rocky rubble. Above and below were the paths of the Jötnar, and thus I risked my head. The well-bought colourful drink I have enjoyed so well, the wise lack for little. For now poetry stir has been brought up again to the ancient shrine of earth. I doubt this, that I could have returned from the settlement of the Jötnar, if I had not enjoyed Gunnlöd, that good wife, whom I laid my arms around. For the next days the frost-thyrses went to ask for the counsels of the High One in the High Hall. For harm worker, bølverk Odin, they asked, if he had come among the bonds, that is, among the gods, or if he had died at Suttunger's hands. A ring oath, that is a marriage pledge, I believe that Odin swore. Who can now believe his words? He betrayed Suttungr when he stole his drink and made Gunnlod weep. It is time to speak from the chair of the Thulur, the reciting sage, by the well of origin. I sat and I was silent, I sat and I thought, I listened to the speech of people. Of runes I heard speak, they did not withhold their counsels. By the high hall, in the high hall, I heard them speak like this. I know that I hung in the wind-swept tree all the 9 nights, pierced with spears, and given to Odin, given self to my own self, on that tree that few know from where his roots have run. No bread did they give to me, no drinking horn either. I peered down, and I took up the runes. Screaming I took them, and screaming I learned them, and fell back again. 9 powerful songs did I learn from the famous son of Börthorn, Bestla's father, and I had a drink of precious mead, ladled from Odrerir, from poetry stir. Then I learned to become wise, and to be wise, and to grow, and to find myself well. Words, me from words, found more words. Deeds, me from deeds, found more deeds. Runes you shall find, and the interpreted symbol, very powerful symbol, very potent symbols. They were colored by the great reciter, and made by the holy powers, and carved by the Shattered One among the gods. Odin with the gods, and for the elves the dead one. Hibernation for the dwarfs, divine wood for the Jötnar, and I myself carved some. Do you know how to carve? Do you know how to interpret? Do you know how to color? Do you know how to test? Do you know how to ask? Do you know how to sacrifice? Do you know how to send? Do you know how to atone? Better not to ask than to sacrifice too much. A gift expects a gift in return. Better not to send than to atone too much. Thus, thin mist, Odin carved it before the peoples emerged, when he ascended and when he returned back. Greetings. In the last video I basically discussed the 2 first stanzas of the Håvamål initiation myth, where Odin explains that he hung in the world tree and descended into the realm of the fate goddesses, in which he picked up the runes of fate, understood them, and shared them with the beings of the world. I talked about how the description of his trial could reflect real rituals of initiation that actually took place in the pagan world of the Vikings and their Iron Age predecessors. These people are known to us as Germanic people. This was a name assigned to them by the Romans 2000 years ago. From the outside, you see, the so-called Germanics looked similar. From the inside, they were quite obsessively tribal. The tribes shared a certain common root language and could understand each other, and they seem to have all originated in Bronze Age Scandinavia, from which many a tribe migrated and thus shared certain cultural and mythological basic structures. However, it is important when you look at the past to realize that history is a matter of editing down a lot of contradictory and confusingly diverse information into a coherent whole. To actually say that all the Germanic people all over Northern Europe for 1,000 years or so thought this and did that is a bit too simple. The truth is that despite a common Bronze Age root, even that root would turn out to be amazingly diverse if you started to look at it closely.
The truth is that the people of the past were as different and diverse in outlook and experience as we are today. Sometimes even more so, because they were more isolated. They didn't have TV or internet. When it came to cultural values, war and peace, class structures and gender roles, matriarchy and patriarchy, which gods were the most popular, things changed. And it changed all the time, from tribe to tribe, from generation to generation, from century to century. Apart from language, there are only a few things that seem to have been shared all the time by all the tribes, or by most of the tribes. And one of these was the presence of a powerful group of women who seemed to have been something in between priestesses and witches. Their power and their influence was quite strong throughout the tribes, independent of the changing roles of women in general, or the degree of warlike behavior in the tribe. If their tribe was warlike, the priestesses participated in war strategy, and many are the sources showing how Germanic chiefs listened intently to their advice, as these priestesses were considered to be allied with the goddesses of fate, and thus the outcome of everything, even war. However, whether the tribe was comparably peaceful or very warlike, the priestesses of the tribe were considered to be their source of wisdom, and I think perhaps generally they were. As I talked about in part 11, some Germanic tribes, such as the Goths, got rid of their priestesses quite early, and they were also the first tribe to become Christian, and to sack the great goddess mystery temple of Eleusis, and to actually even sack Rome, destroy civilization, and start the Dark Ages. Go figure. Well, I'm talking about the priestesses again, because as I also mentioned in part 11, they partook in male initiation rituals, and one of their most important functions there seemed to have been the ritual serving of a magical brew, usually referred to as the precious mead. Archaeology testifies that all over northern Europe from about 700 BC and until the end of the Viking Age during the 10th century AD, great ladies were buried with full ritual gear, graves that show their importance and their power in life as well as their profession. They were leaders of rituals and users of magic, and not the least, they were servers of the precious mead. These ladies serving mead are part of a very important recurring theme in the Norse myths, that of a supernatural lady in the underworld who serves the precious mead after the hero has undergone dangerous trials of initiation. There is also a sacred marriage involved. The lady of the myths is, through metaphorical mythical attributes, identified as the goddess Freyja, who indeed is supposed to meet the chosen dead in her ninth realm of the cosmos. It seems probable that the ladies who participated in such rituals in real life also were supposed to represent the goddess, temporarily present in a living woman during the ritual. You may wonder why I'm talking about this when I was going to continue the talk about the hanging of Odin. Well, as I said last time, I was discussing the two first stanzas in the hanging story, in which he basically hung and then descended to the roots of the world tree, in which he grasped the runes of destiny. This was not the only thing that happened there. In the following stanza, you see, number 140, Odin explains how he was taught 9 Hyndluljóð, which means 9 powerful songs, by his maternal uncle. And I shall talk about what they may have meant and what the maternal uncle may have meant in a ritual context later. For now, I shall move on to how these 9 spell songs led Odin to a place where he, according to the stanza, received a precious drink of mead, poured out from poetry blend. Nothing more is said about this event in these particular stanzas, but that is a typical Old Norse poetic way of making a metaphorical riddle, referring to something the listener is expected to already know and be able to deduce for themselves. Luckily, the precious mead and the poetry blend is mentioned and described in more detail earlier in the same poem, which is why the theme is not elaborated more here. Because if you had paid proper attention to what was being said earlier, you would realize that here comes another piece of the puzzle that adds to our knowledge of the whole sacred story. Now, those of you who already know a bit about Norse mythology have probably heard the story of how Odin stole the mead of poetry from the giants. If you have probably been presented with the version told by Snorri in the Prose Edda. I'm going to stick to an older version, the version of the Håvamål of the Poetic Edda, because that version is older and more authentic and is not trying to hide what it was all about. You see, Snorri was trying to disguise the initiation team so as to get away with writing about the pagan lore in the first place. He told us how Odin tricked a giant maiden into sleeping with him so that he could drink all her mead and run off. He describes the girl as loose-lived and dim-witted, but the Håvamål tells another story. In the Håvamål, we are told that Odin went to the land of the age-old giant called Suttungur, which means heavy with drink. This is, I believe, one of the many names of the world giant who lives in the cosmic ocean beneath the world tree, together with his wife Ran and their 9 daughters. In his halls, Odin, helped by the 9 spell songs taught to him on the way, displays his eloquence and in this way mysteriously saves his own life. It is made very clear that he would not have died if he could not talk himself out of it. The world he has come to is a dark, deadly realm. It's a realm of death, in fact, an underworld, as shown by its attributes of being dark and rocky and deadly, and in fact situated within a mound, a burial mound. It is not so difficult perhaps to imagine that the people who let the initiates hang for 9 days and almost die would not hesitate to place them in a muck burial mound afterwards, in which they were to achieve their consecration, the marriage with the Lady of the Dead. You see, when Odin had managed to use his intelligence and eloquence to survive in this underworld, he swears a sacred ring oath which is the same as being married. And then the giantess called Gunnlod, whose name means invitation to battle, is revealed to him, sitting on a golden chair, offering him the precious mead that she guards. They get married, and later she helps him turn into a drill snake or an eagle, different versions here, so that he can escape death and return to Earth. There is a betrayal theme in the story that I will have to go into later. For now, let it suffice to say that this is as close as a myth can get to describing real-life ritual. There is evidence that people did go through mock sacrifice to Odin, in which they were mock hanged and mock stabbed, in which they fasted for 9 days and definitely faced death, but with a certain chance of returning to life. There is textual and archaeological evidence that people would indeed meditate on top of or even walk ritually into burial mounds in order to converse with the spirit beings of the underworld. There is even archaeological and textual evidence that priestesses existed whose job it was to preside over a sacred mead drinking ritual, and that they were even buried with a serving spoon in their hands, ready to offer the mead to a brave warrior who dared to seek her underworld abode. And historians and archaeologists alike all agree that some sort of sacred marriage in connection to initiation rituals seemed to have taken place both during the Scandinavian Bronze Age and in the Iron Age tribes known to us as the Germanics, as well as during the Viking Age. And I think it's also something that happened with the Celts. Well, anyway, I think it all adds up. The story of Odin hanging reflects, describes and attempts to explain the origin of a very important ritual of initiation that may have been shared by most of these Germanic tribes. It was a ritual of initiation undergone by men who sought to rule their own fate, to wake up the sleeping fate goddess within and symbolically marry her, to gain access to esoteric knowledge and abilities, and to become something apart from the ordinary, whether that was to become a great warrior, a sorcerer, a priest, a bard, or a king. The story of the hanging also tells the tale of how the path of initiation for men was instigated, because it was first staked out by Odin, and he had learned it from the ancient witch, and she, before he asked her to teach him, she was teaching the women only. Now Odin learned it, and he taught it to his priest. And because of his deed, it is stated in the poem, because he did this, because he died, because he learned, because he resurrected, he became a god. The poem is very clear about it. He wasn't a god before that. He became a god through this ritual of initiation. A god with the right to receive the annual apple of restoration from the goddess. An apple that ensures his divine immortality, which is not so accurately immortality, but rather the ability to transform death over and over as his youth is restored every year. In part 11, I talked about how Freyja, in the shape of a witch, showed to Odin how to conquer fate, the ultimate fate being death, and that this led him to seek that knowledge. In that myth, the goddess is called Golden Brew, which refers to the precious mead. Throughout the myths, the mead is referred to and described as precious, ancient, filled with universal memory, with power, with poetry, with creative power, knowledge, and the power to transform. It is guarded by the goddess in all her countless shapes. Hel guards it but keeps it under lock. Giantesses offer it when heroes have had the courage to reach their underworld halls. Freyja guards it and offers it to those who are allowed into her halls after death. The Valkyries offer it to the chosen of Valhalla, and they draw their mead from the teats of the goat Heidrun, which means bright secret. And this she-goat, identified as Freyja herself in a poem, produces the mead by nourishing herself from the world tree. This world tree again is nourished by the well of origin, the Urdarbrunnr, by the oldest fate goddess called Urdur, meaning origin. And in the Rafngaldur Odins, in the Raven's spell song of Odin, we learn that the keeper of the mead of poetry is in fact the fate goddess Origin, so that ultimately we may say that the mead is essentially the waters of origin, the waters of fate, death, resurrection and memory, and as Snorri describes it in his Prose Edda, those waters. He says, those who come into that sacred water of the fate goddesses will emerge transformed, shining and transparent, like the membrane of the inside of an eggshell. So, I'm going to finish here. So, have a nice day.
Yeah, so that was the video number 13 from the Hidden Knowledge in Old Norse Myths series that I did, Precious Mead and Sacred Marriage. Now, there is a great difference between this story and the story told by Snorri. Snorri explained how Odin sneaked into the hall of the giants and secretly had sex with the girl and tricked her into giving him the mead. This older version, however, shows Odin as a man who asks a father for a girl's hand in marriage. His eloquence, and remember now, eloquence was a most valued virtue during the Viking Age. His eloquence wins him the bride, who is not at all shown as a silly girl, but as a lady seated on a golden throne who freely offers her mead to him. First of all, there is plenty of archaeological evidence that the offering of mead by a woman was indeed an important part of Germanic rituals, and there were women who seem to have been priestesses or witches who specialized in such mead offering rituals. There is also evidence that rituals of sacred marriage as a part of initiation rituals were very common in Northern Europe from the Bronze Age and onwards. So what is described here, the hanging, the teachings, and the subsequent offering of mead by a woman, as well as the sacred marriage in the underworld, all have parallels in real-life rituals that actually happened in pagan Scandinavia. However, let's go back to the mythical aspects. Now, this mead has a story. In the Poetic Edda, it is often referred to as the minnisdrikker, the mead of memory, or as innmæra mjöður, the precious mead, or as the fornsmjöður, the ancient mead, or more literally, the mead of the past. And it is offered by a female figure who is always associated with gold and light and brightness, and she always dwells in the darkness of the underworld, which is what the world of the giants is. Her halls are always well guarded and surrounded by dangerous fences. Indeed, the hall of Freya may only be entered by those that she invites. The mead gives infinite wisdom, power, and transformation. I need a whole video to talk about just the mead, but this is basically the drink of immortality, and it is always guarded by the goddess in one of her countless shapes. According to Snorri, the mead began as the essence of all the gods and goddesses together. Through the art of Seiðr, Odin and Freya created a being from this mead who wandered the world just like its creators did, and who was accessible to everyone who asked for wisdom. However, the wisdom was monopolized by two dwarfs who wanted it all for themselves, and then the being of wisdom was killed. This was basically how the mead of poetry, inspiration, wisdom, knowledge, and transformation ended up being hidden beneath shields in the underworld, guarded by the goddess. It is accessible only to those who, like Odin, dare to undertake the initiation trial of death, and who manages to make his way into the realm of the goddess, the realm of the soul, the light within the darkness of the darkest pits of hell. This is his initiation. So, Odin drinks the precious mead and is married technically to the Lady of the Dead, who dwells in the underworld. But he has other plans. He wants to bring the mead back with him to the living world, and he wants to share it with others. He wants to place the mead in what he refers to as the ancient shrine of earth. So, helped by the goddess, he escapes, first by becoming a serpent of death. The underworld is crammed with serpents, symbols of transformation, and then he becomes an eagle of death, like Svelgr, the corpse swallower, and he flies. According to Snorri, he is followed by Suttungr in eagle's disguise, and the wind blows as the eagle flaps his wings. Suttungr, the mead-heavy one, or the grief-heavy one, is no other than the eagle of death. Odin makes a narrow escape, and the last stanzas of the story explains how he now has become a god living among gods. That means he had to work for his divine status. Another big point is made out of how he betrayed the goddess. He laments how she loved him and helped him and saved his life. Without her, he would never have made it out. However, he betrays her. He betrays the ring oath of sacred marriage to the goddess. What does this mean? Well, I have been uncertain about what exactly that means myself. Odin seems to be the villain here, who leaves his wife and she cries. There is a second parallel story to this one told by Snorri. Freya was once married to Odr, which is of course the same as Odin, since Odin is just the word Odr put together with the suffix hin to indicate the Odr, the spirit. So the spirit and the soul were married. They even had 2 daughters, and then he left, vanished mysteriously, and we are not told why in this version of the story. But as Odin left, or Odr left, Freya started to travel the world in search of him, teaching as she went, and leaving behind her tears of pure red gold. Red gold being a metaphor for divine enlightenment and wisdom. And she seeks spirit, she seeks poetry. Moreover, there is a third parallel story told by Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish medieval storyteller. After the death of Baldur, who symbolizes wisdom, Odin sets about to ensure that someone will be born who can avenge Baldur. Metaphorically, that means someone who can destroy the blind and ignorant aggression, höder blindi, it actually means blind strife, that killed Baldur, as in killed wisdom in the first place. Ignorant struggle kills wisdom. But to do that, Odin ends up committing a crime. You see, he is the spirit, and after the loss of wisdom in the world, people no longer want spirit. They want material riches. And this is illustrated in how Odin tries to make love to a woman whose name is Rinder, which means to reject, from the word rinda. That is, she rejects spirit when he arrives. Odin, knowing that the woman will give birth to the choice that will restore Baldur, causes the spirit-rejecting woman to go mad, has the people tie her to the bed, and then he rapes her. And that is, of course, extremely upsetting, I know, but we have to look at these stories as metaphorical stories. They were meant as allegories, so we have to look for what it means instead of getting upset about the topic here. So this can mean a lot of things. It may refer to Odin as the representative of a patriarchal and oppressive system, but then, remembering that he is spirit, she may represent women and the fate of women when they no longer assume spiritual authority. Or the woman may even represent human beings and their fate when they reject the spiritual. That, rejecting the spiritual, is what I think, because the goal here is to force the spirit rejecter to give birth to a new choice, the choice to destroy ignorance forever. When the spirit is rejected, he causes a great trauma, the rape, and through trauma, human beings may learn, even though it may take a lot of pain before we finally decide to seek the spirit in ourselves. Anyway, when the other gods hear about his crime, Odin is expelled from the divine realms and has to travel the world as an exile. Now, this is spirit we are talking about. It is serious when spirit is expelled from the divine order of things. Suddenly, the divine union between God and goddess, between spirit and soul, between wisdom and love, between poetry and history is disrupted, and it affects us all. To get to the point, the story of how Odin betrayed the goddess is the story of how the spirit of humankind has separated itself from its original sacred union with the All-Soul. After that event, the god and the goddess are scattered across the universe, appearing in countless shapes. We are them, and history happens, because they are constantly on the move, constantly changing shape, constantly learning and constantly teaching. Freedom from this endless world story happens to each and every one of us who decide to make a choice of reuniting with the wholeness of soul and spirit. Odin was taught these songs from the famous son of Bölthorn, Besla's father. Now Besla is Odin's giantess mother, so the son of her father is Odin's maternal uncle. The maternal uncle is a very important teacher figure in Germanic initiation myths. He appears again and again, and is probably derived from the fact that once upon a time, at least some Germanic tribes were matrilineal rather than patriarchal, and that the brother of the mother had a duty to teach and raise his sister's sons. This is described in Tacitus' Germania, among other sources, where this Roman writer, Tacitus, who wrote this around the year 80 after Christ, or 1,000 years ago almost, 2,000 years ago, explained that maternal uncles were more important role models and educators to men in Germanic societies than even their own fathers. The mother's brother was more important in his education. In the mythical and legendary sources, these maternal uncles also had a priestly or shamanistic function in society, which may reflect a certain hereditary tradition when it comes to learning spiritual practices. In the Völsunga saga, a maternal uncle teaches his nephew, who is also his son, because he had with his own sister, Anyway, this nephew's son is taught by his maternal uncle / father to change shape into animals and to heal. In the initiation myth of Sigurd in the Poetic Edda, the maternal uncle performs divination in the style of Seiðr, which I have been calling witchcraft. And in this initiation story, the maternal uncle teaches powerful songs. All these stories show the shamanistic maternal uncle in the process of helping his nephew to begin his journey of initiation. So maybe you sort of just called your mentor, your teacher for your uncle, perhaps. We don't know. Odin is taught 9 powerful songs, which is of course a significant number of songs, as we discussed in earlier. The number 9 reflects the worlds in which death is the rule. Powerful songs may be another name for the art of galdrar, spell songs. The word galdir is derived from the verb gala, which means to sing in a high-pitched tune. It was a way of casting spells and was a well-known practice in Norse society. Other names for spell songs are vardlokkur, which means calls for the spirits, or Seiðlæti, the sound of Seiðr, the sound of the craft. To sing a spell song, a galdir, could be a way of casting spells, but it could also have a healing effect. In the poem Oddrun gråter, spell songs are used by a valkyria to help a woman through childbirth. Snorri relates how the wounded god Thor was healed by the spell songs of a witch giantess called Groa. This giantess, Groa, whose name means to grow, later appears in an Edda poem called the Groa Galdir, the spell songs to grow. The spell songs of growing, where the spell songs are meant to help a boy through his initiation, no less. So do the spell songs of the maternal uncle help Odin? Yes, indeed, because the next line tells us how he finally received the precious cup of mead poured to him from the cauldron called Úðrerir, the poetry blend. And then, apparently, Odin just returns and has become a wise man. And now we go on to chapter 9.3, Odin and the Goddess. And this is also from YouTube video, The Hidden Knowledge in Old Norse Myths, that I had back in 2010, 2011, and 2012. This was video 27, Odin in Myth, History and the Sacred Marriage. Thank you.
Hello! Today I'm going to talk about possible historical truths hidden in myth and legend, with special emphasis on Odin and the institution of sacred marriage in connection to kingship inauguration. Now, we do not know exactly how old Odin is as a god. The first evidence for his cult date back almost 2000 years, but I will take us still further back in time to the Bronze Age. Now, I'm not an archaeologist, so what I'm saying now is based on the book called The Chariot of the Sun and Other Rites and Symbols of the Northern Bronze Age, published in 1969 by Peter Gelling and Hilda Ellis Davidson. In their book, Gelling and Davidson analysed rock paintings made by Bronze Age people in Scandinavia dating between 1800 and 500 BC, which is roughly the era of the Bronze Age in Scandinavia. Gelling and Davidson concluded that there was substantial evidence that, despite the existence of other deities and powers, there were 4 major deities which completely dominated the religious scene, and at the center was the worship of the sun. Countless images show the sun disk in some mythical situation, and countless others show people worshipping the sun disk in all kinds of ways. The sun was worshipped by warriors parading with their sun disk shields and weapons, and the sun was carried as an emblem above the priests' heads and fastened with sticks to people's hands like this. And the sun was worshipped by acrobats and dancers, most of whom were female and often performing aboard a ship sacred to the sun. Gelling and Davidson do not conclude about the sun's gender in the Bronze Age, but suggest that it may have been female or at least androgynous, because it is often shown as being penetrated and or adored by a man with a very passionate expression that may not in any way be misunderstood. And the conclusion is that the sun disk often engaged in sexual activities with male gods or worshippers. Personally, I think it is obvious that the sun in the Bronze Age was a goddess, since absolutely all the Nordic and Germanic languages name the sun as a female from the very beginning, and because in later times Sol of Scandinavia and Sunna of Germany were clearly goddesses. Snorri counted Sol, the sun, among the Åsynjur, the goddesses, and in the Poetic Edda it is said that the sun gives birth to a daughter who will follow in her mother's path. And the sun goddess is also important in creation, where when she comes from the south and gathers all the horses of heaven, which I guess are the planets, with her right hand, whatever that means, and then begins to shine on the rocky surface of the earth goddess, who then brings forth life. Another reason for claiming that the Bronze Age sun was a goddess is the fact that all its attributes, chariot, ship and spirals, are all attributes of the northern goddesses, who are always described as bright golden white, golden red, shining bright, bringing forth rays of light and rays of lightning, and not to say Freya, who weeps tears of gold and who owns the Brisinga men, which means the jewel of the flames, which I take to be a heiti for the sun. So we have a Bronze Age scenario in Scandinavia where a sun goddess was at the center of public festivities, worshipped by men doing warrior dances and women doing acrobatics, and priests walking in procession with the lady's disc and spiral emblems. Next to this goddess, 3 male gods, very obviously male, no doubt about it, basically. Ancient Scandinavians were even less demure than modern ones. Well, 3 very male and, let us say, very virile gods take up the flanks around the Golden Lady, interacting with her, having sex with her, and carrying her emblem on their bodies, on their shields, or above their heads like priests. That these gods were sort of divine or supernatural priests is very likely. Not only do they appear like worshippers and as lovers of the sun goddess, so that they could be taken for priests, but they are also larger than life and have their own emblems or attributes, so that they must be recognized as gods at the same time. In this light, I think it is significant that Snorri actually called the Æsir gods for priests. The gods, according to Snorri, were hovgodir and blodgodir, which means temple priests and sacrificial priests. And both in Edda and Skaldic poetry we encounter Æsir gods in the act of performing sacrifice and ritual incantations in honor of powers even greater than themselves. The 3 male gods are recognized by their attributes and emblems, which sometimes take their place. A virile, giant-sized man wielding an axe, or just the image of an axe as his emblem representing him, is called the axe god by Gelling and Davidson. Then there is the sword god, who is an equally virile man wielding a sword, or he's just represented by the sword emblem on its own. And finally, there is the spear god, represented by the spear as an emblem, or by a huge man wielding a spear. Gelling and Davidson pointed out that the 3 Bronze Age gods are symbolized by attributes that belong clearly to later Norse gods of the Viking Age. The axe god would be an early predecessor of Thor, the thunder god, the one god whom we know existed in Europe and Asia at least 5,000 years ago. Knowing this, it is very reasonable to assume that the ancient thunder god is identical with the axe-wielding god of the Bronze Age rock carvings. The sword god could be an early predecessor of Freyr, an assumption which is powerfully strengthened by the fact that the sword god is often associated with pigs or boars, as well as horses, which were later animals sacred to Freyr. And then there is the spear god. We know that the god Odin's favorite weapon was the spear, and that his spear symbolizes his choices. When he points or hurls his spear at someone, it is to choose them for his own. So, is this proof that the gods Thor, Freyr and Odin were worshipped already almost 4,000 years ago in Scandinavia? No, it's not proof, but as Gelling and Davidson suggest, it is quite remarkable that the three major male deities of the Bronze Age pantheon share the primary attributes of the three major male deities of the Viking Age, namely axe hammer, sword and spear. And this is hardly coincidental, and could at least be evidence that the three Viking Age gods, as well as the goddess Freya, inherited some central symbols associated with a much older religion, dating back almost 4,000 years. Now, is there any other evidence that the Viking Age religion is based on a Bronze Age prototype? Not really, as far as I know, but we could turn to Snorri's tales in the Edda and the Heimskringla. Now, from a modern point of view, Snorri was not a great historian. In fact, when I studied Norse literature, one of my co-students asked if there could be any real foundation for Snorri's historical approach to the origin of the Norse gods. Our tutors immediately warned us to never go there if we wanted an academic career. To claim that there is any historical basis to Snorri's tale whatsoever would be an academic suicide. Some of us tried to ask why exactly, pointing out that, well, Thor Heyerdahl had tried to excavate evidence about this, but had to stop digging because of, due to lack of funding. Now, the answer was that Thor Heyerdahl was a mock scientist and should never be referred to by serious scholars. So, I later figured out what exactly was the reason why Snorri's tales are not believed by modern scholars. It is said that his tales bear evidence of a European medieval tradition of claiming classical ancestry in order to glorify one's past, with no real basis in history whatsoever. Well, since I'm not going to pursue an academic career, I dare to go where no serious scholar is allowed to tread. I do not believe that Snorri's tale is actual history, but I believe that there may indeed be shreds of truth in it, shreds of ancient memories. We know that myths and legends can be transmitted orally over thousands of years, and that they sometimes refer to historical events. So why not, really? So what is all the fuss about? Snorri claimed that Odin was a prince of Troy, a Bronze Age city in Anatolia, present-day Turkey. He was there married to a clairvoyant woman called Frigida, and they were descendants of Thor, the thunder god, and his clairvoyant wife Sibylla, hence the Viking Age Sif. If there is any trace of real history in this tale, I would suggest that what could be the reality behind the legend is that there were a people dwelling in the southeast, possibly Anatolia, possibly even Troy, as Snorri suggests. A people who worshipped the ancient thunder god and his wife and saw themselves as their descendants. And the Odin of this legend may be covering for a distant memory of a certain leader, general or king who claimed to be the descendant of the thunder god. Even more likely, Odin in this legend is a singular archetypal representation of many such leaders who were all seen as incarnating a divine king while holding the royal office. I actually think that this is quite likely, and I will explain why later. In Snorri's tale, Odin leads his people on a quest towards the lands of the north, conquering some people, marrying into other people, spreading their language and their religion, which was strongly based on good old-fashioned pagan sorcery and shamanism. And only when they came to the land of the wise Vanir did they meet real resistance, but managed to make a truce with the Vanir, and soon the two divine tribes blended in friendship and marriage, instigating an era of peace and prosperity and wisdom to everyone. This was also when their religions blended. The goddess of the Vanir and her three male companions became members of the Seiðr tribe. The Seiðr, according to Snorri, were so called because they came from Asia. Now, could there be any truth in this story? Again, I shall blaspheme against the ruling paradigm and say that yes, there is likely a shred of truth in it. Let us ask the first question. Is it likely that a people led by some kind of Odin-like figure, or worshipping a divine prototype of Odin, descendant of the thunder god, incarnated in their kings, who did move from the southeast to the northwest and came to dominate the cultures of Northern Europe? Certainly. We have to go back a bit before the Scandinavian Bronze Age into the late Neolithic, that is, we have to go back about 4,000 years from now, to find plenty of evidence that a new culture did indeed spread over time, beginning in the southeast of Europe and moving slowly to the northwest during the millennium preceding the Scandinavian Bronze Age. It is not unlikely that they may have eventually brought the Bronze Age with them, since the Bronze Age began a lot earlier in the southeast than in the northwest. The new invading culture was completely different from the old one. The old culture of Scandinavia during the late Neolithic period was a megalithic, clan-based culture. It was communal and egalitarian, as we see that no individual was significantly elevated above others. This is shown both in graves, where everybody, no matter what gender or age or status in the tribe, were buried as equals in big communal clan graves. And we also see it in their dwellings, which show that everybody in the clan lived together in the same big house. They were peaceful, and there is no evidence for war, at least. And they were matrilineal, which we know because of modern DNA. The women of the burials are all related, whereas the men came from the outside. This means that the women remained within their clans their whole lives, together with their mothers, sisters, aunts, grandmothers, and cousins, and fathers. The men, on the other hand, had to move into the clan of the wife, and thus had to live and deal with the in-laws for the rest of their lives. So we do not know much about their gender relations. As said, the graves and buildings bear evidence of basic equality. But in such a society, it is likely to assume that the women were the backbone of the clan, those who did not change or move away, and could expect the support of their families in everyday life, every day, and thus most probably had a very strong position. I think personally that the cult of the ancestral mothers that was still so strong in the Viking Age may very well have been a remnant of this ancient megalithic culture. The new invading culture was completely different from the older culture, insofar as it was hierarchical, caste-based, warlike and patriarchal. And during the Bronze Age, these two cultures blended and compromised, and I think that the truce between the Seiðr and the Vanir of Norse myths may likely reflect this historical event. This merging may also explain the institution of the sacred marriage, where a king had to marry the ancestral mother of the tribe in order to legitimize his rule. What we do have to dismiss completely, however, is the idea that this invasion happened during the lifetime of one king called Wodan or Odin. Archaeology shows that the spread of their warrior culture happened slowly, over many generations. What is possible, however, is that they did worship a Wodan Odin figure, and that their kings were seen as living incarnations of this god. Married to a clairvoyant goddess, as Snorri explained that all the kings of Troy, from Fonar to Wodan, were married to clairvoyant women. The earliest known hard evidence for a Wodan cult does indeed picture the god as married to a fate-knowing goddess, and we will come back to that later. Second question is, if a particular culture that worshipped a king god and a clairvoyant goddess did indeed move up to dominate northern cultures before the onset of the Bronze Age, could they have come from Troy or thereabouts? Well, that is pure speculation, but it's not impossible. Troy was a big town already by 3000 BC, so the place already existed by the time of the south to north migration of the new culture. The migration could technically have begun there, and there is no doubt whatsoever that there were strong cultural connections between the Bronze Age Trojans, their Greek counterparts, and the Scandinavian culture during the Bronze Age. No doubt whatsoever, and there must be a reason for why Bronze Age cultures all over Europe had so much in common. Migration from Anatolia to Scandinavia just before the Bronze Age began is a very probable reason. Third question is, what about the Vanir tribe who met the Aesir with such resistance? If the legend of the war and truce between the Vanir and the Aesir gods had any basis in history, we have to consider when this could have happened and where. Thor Heyerdahl believed that it happened someplace in Eastern Europe, basing himself on certain place names that resemble place names mentioned by Snorri. But then, why is the event only remembered in Scandinavia? We don't know, but let us ask who exactly the newcomers from Asia encountered when they came up here. They would have encountered at least two different kinds of Neolithic cultures existing in Scandinavia at the time. The hunter-gatherers, who became the ancestors of the Sami people, and the megalithic farmers. Yes, we had megaliths here in Scandinavia too, especially in Denmark and southern Sweden. And I've already said something about that culture. They were communal, clan-based, there was equality between the members of the clans, within the clans, and they followed a matrilineal law of descent where men moved into their wives' families and ancestral mothers were the focus of ancestral worship. In the Norse sources, the Vanir are described as exceedingly wise, a lot wiser than the Aesir. They are the know-alls whose magic was powerful enough to withstand the Aesir attack where no one else had succeeded. They were seen as great magicians. Indeed, it was the goddess of the Vanir who taught Odin how to master the art of Seiðr. So, in my personal opinion, without claiming any scientific proof, I would say that the Vanir of the legend could represent the megalith builders of the Scandinavian Stone Age, inheritors of a grand tradition of an astronomical and architectural science that we today still find completely mystifying. How did they build the megaliths? So if we find them mystifying, knowing all the things we know, imagine what they must have appeared like to a tribe of barbarians, to their contemporaries, to the barbarian invaders, who for all their warrior aristocratic bravado, these guardians of the megaliths must have appeared to be exceedingly well versed in mysteries and magic. If the legends are to be believed, the newcomers were certainly impressed and sought to be initiated into the mysteries of the native Scandinavian megalith builders. I think it's actually quite remarkable that in the Norse worldview there were three great tribes of power beings, the Aesir, the Vanir and the Jotnir. They could all represent a legendary version of the three cultures that actually did coexist during the late Scandinavian Stone Age and into the Bronze Age. 1. The invading warrior culture from the southeast, 2. The megalith farmers, and 3. The hunter-gatherers. By the time of the Bronze Age in Scandinavia, the megalith farmers had indeed merged with the invading culture, whereas the hunter-gatherers maintained a separate identity and became the Sami people. And this could be reflected in the legend of how the Aesir and the Vanir people merged, whereas the Jotnir remained a separate tribe associated with the wilderness. We also know that the new invading culture brought with them the ancient Indo-European thunder god. They may also have brought with them the cult of a sacred king who impersonated one of their most important gods, Wodan, or Odin, or at least his predecessor, who was seen as a descendant of the thunder god. Later, we know that Odin became the All-Father and the father of the thunder god, but in earlier times the descent was reversed. This reversal may have happened quite late, because in the year 80 AD, Tacitus claimed that the German tribes believed that the thunder god was their ancestor, their All-Father. So Odin sort of swapped place with Thor. Anyway, this culture of the thunder god and the divine king god merged with the megalith farmer culture who may have worshipped a goddess, the Vanadis, which literally means the goddess of the Vanir, and according to the legend she had 3 male companions, her father Njord, her brother Freyr, and her mysterious protector and hero Heimdallr, the god of the universe, who returned the fiery jewel to the goddess. Odin and the thunder god may have merged with two of these three companions, leaving only two original Vanir gods in the ancient formula of one goddess and three gods. The original Vanir gods in the formula was Freya and Freyr, who are significantly siblings from the original Vanir tribe. By the time of the Bronze Age, the great goddess of the Vanir was probably worshipped in the shape of the sun goddess, surrounded by her brother, the sword god, and the two newcomers with their axes and spears, Thor and Odin, who in many ways blend easily with respectively Njord and Heimdallr. If there is any historical truth in the legend, as I have now suggested, although it would be difficult to prove for certain, it is quite interesting to note that Snorri described the prototypical Odin as a prototypical king god married to a clairvoyant priestess goddess. This brings us into the Iron Age and the first known temples dedicated to Wodan, the Iron Age predecessor of Odin. Now, this part of the talk is based on the work by the historian Michael Enright in his book Lady with a Mead Cup, Ritual, Prophecy and Lordship in the European Warband from Lathene to the Viking Age. In this book, Enright points out that the earliest representations of Wodan is as a sacred king god married to a clairvoyant goddess called Rosmerta. Shrines to this divine couple were erected almost 2000 years ago in Western Europe. Rosmerta means the great provider, which brings to mind one Norse goddess, Gefjon, whose name means the provider. And a short form of the name Gefjon is Gefn, which Snorri says is one of Freya's names. And we know that Frigg and Freya were once the same goddess and that both were married to Odin. So are there any other indications that the Iron Age Rosmerta, the great provider, could be associated with Freya or other Norse goddesses? Indeed, Rosmerta, like Freya, is depicted in the shrines as a clairvoyant oracle goddess who owns a necklace, carries a cultic staff or wand, and whose central function is the serving of sacred mead. She is the prototypical divine witch priestess of Norse and Celtic religions. So where did Rosmerta come from? Wearing the name Rosmerta, this goddess came from the Celtic region and was earlier married to the Celtic god Lugh. In regions where there were a lot of Roman influence, Lugh's place as Rosmerta's consort is taken by the Roman god Mercury, and in the German regions, Mercury's and Lugh's place by Rosmerta's side is Wodan, their old Odin. So this means that the earliest hard evidence for a Wodan cult 2000 years ago emphasizes his role as a king in sacred marriage to a divine priestess. So how old is the institution of sacred marriage? Well, there is plenty of evidence for a sacred marriage cult in Scandinavia already during the Bronze Age. Marriage scenes, or let us say ritual sex scenes, that is, a sexual act is depicted surrounded by religious symbolism and images of people performing ritual movements around the couple. And these images abound in Bronze Age art. But where do they abound? They are found close to sacred places and groves, but most of them are actually found within graves. This is why these sex scenes are not interpreted as Bronze Age pornography, despite all their explicitness. They are clearly depictions of a sacred act, the hieros gamos, or sacred marriage between two deities or between a human and his goddess. So we do not know if the Bronze Age sacred marriage was associated with kingship, but it is very likely. Moving a bit forward to the Iron Age, especially towards the 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th centuries AD in Northern Europe, there is new evidence for a bloom in the ancient ritual of sacred marriage in connection to kingship inauguration. One Norwegian professor of Norse mythology, Gro Steinsland, has shown how the memory of the sacred marriage and kingship cult is strongly present in Norse myths. Comparing these to similar Celtic myths and to other religions where the sacred marriage was an institution already 5,000 years ago, such as in ancient Sumer, a picture emerges. When kingship was introduced in Europe during the late Stone Age and early Bronze Ages, a new institution was established almost everywhere: the sacred marriage, where a king, in order to be accepted by his people as their king, had to be accepted by the goddess of the land and marry her. The goddess represented both the land and the people living in the land. She was their ancestral mother, their provider. The king was responsible for keeping the goddess happy. If she was satisfied in her marriage, she would provide abundance and make her children happy. If she was unsatisfied with her husband, she would withdraw the bounty of the land and send famine, war and pestilence onto her children. The lady basically had to be pleased. Thus, the people had to choose a king carefully, one who could please her and inspire her to create abundance and prosperity, peace and happiness. In ancient Sumer, a great deal of emphasis was placed on the king's ability to please the goddess sexually. He had to offer her many gifts, prostrate before her, sing her praises, raise a throne to her, seduce her with caresses and loving words, and when she had consented to wed him, she would bed him, and many of the oldest religious hymns ever written down in our world are detailed and very explicit descriptions of how the Sumerian goddess finds pleasure in her husband during sacred marriage. And the funniest thing for us is that this all happened on stage with thousands of onlookers, the goddess being represented by a priestess. And the pleasure of the goddess was emphasized in the hymns as something great, beautiful and sacred, because when the goddess thrived in this way, she would automatically bring forth bounty. As she was enjoying herself, the flowers would bloom, the fields would grow, and good fortune and prosperity would come to the people. And if the crops failed, if there was pestilence, if the king failed to protect the peace by holding back enemies, it would be said that he was a bad husband for the goddess, and there are several indications that he would be sacrificed. So, is this ancient Mesopotamian tradition in any way relevant to the modern ritual of sacred marriage and kingship? There are indeed many parallels, but we do not know as many details. Because unlike the Sumerians, the Scandinavians had not yet invented writing. So apparently the institution of sacred marriage had dwindled by the late Viking Age, if not even earlier. And the only texts we have are much younger than that. But there are quite a few indications, such as the sacrifice of a king, which certainly happened in Scandinavia when there was famine in the land. Then the body part of the sacrificed king would be brought around the land with the hope that the land would provide once more. And there is also a very significant story about a king who rode ritually in a circle around the Dísarsalinn, which means the temple of the goddess. During the Great Dísating, the Parliament of the Goddesses, which was the name of the annual assembly at Uppsala in Sweden during the Viking Age, the king had to show his worth by circling the temple of the goddess, and if his horse stumbled or he fell off, he was no longer favored by the goddess and no longer fit to rule. So I and many others believe that the Scandinavian sacred marriage in connection to kingship is powerfully related to the much older Mesopotamian ritual, and it is thought that the idea spread from there and into Europe during the Bronze Age, which would explain why the rituals are so similar everywhere. The only thing that makes the Northern tradition stand out as different from the Sumerian, as far as I know, is the emphasis on a drinking ritual in connection to the sacred marriage, as I've been talking about before. The drinking ritual is probably particular to an Indo-European tradition known to the Celts and the Norse and German cultures, with clear connection to Soma, the sacred drink of the Indian Vedas, and to Haoma, the sacred drink of the Iranian Avesta texts. These ancient Indo-European traditions blended with the originally Mesopotamian ritual of sacred marriage, as the ritual became established all over Europe during the Bronze Age. My guess is that the ritual of sacred marriage is a result of the emergence of a warrior aristocracy who wanted the people to be ruled and protected by a strong military leader, the king, and in order to legitimize kingship, the power of one man over many people, the king had to prove that he was worthy of leading the people by being accepted and loved by the goddess on whom the people depended for their fortune and for their prosperity. So as long as the king managed to keep the people happy, it was seen as the blessings of the goddess and as a proof that the king incarnated the husband brother of the goddess. Now, in the beginning, the kings of Sumer were quite humble in their role. They were titled not as kings actually, but as the overseers and the caretakers of the goddess, like men who ruled under her guidance, a bit like caretakers of the land on behalf of the goddess. And as long as he pleased the goddess, she would provide. The king was elected by the people in Sumer, as he later was in Northern Europe. Yes, the kings were elected by the parliaments even towards the end of the Viking Age, and both the Sumerian and the Norse king knew that if he failed to please his people, protect them, secure the peace and inspire fertility in the goddess of the land, he would be sacrificed and another would replace him. In both cultures, power relations changed over time, and the king gradually became a little bit more secure in their positions, but the age-old ritual of sacred marriage continued as a powerful symbol of why the king was allowed to rule, and this was going on for thousands of years. In order to prove his worth, Saga and Edda sources strongly suggest that the king had to go through a series of trials, a great initiation, before he could be accepted by the parliament and voted in. A king was expected to be a semi-divine person. He would incarnate the god and possess secret esoteric knowledge, as it is said in the Yggdrasill poem. En koner unger kunni runor. Finn runar och alder runar, mer kunni han, monnum bjerga, eggar deifa, ägi legja. Meaning, and King Yong knew the runes of fate and the runes of the ages. More he knew, he could save the people, he could blunt the blades and heal the wounds. And this stanza shows us the kind of things a king in Scandinavia was expected to know and be able to do. He had to be like a priest or a sorcerer in his knowledge of runes and secret mysteries. He had to go through the same initiations as them. He had to be able to throw spells and to protect his people, and he had to be able to heal. He had to display this kind of knowledge before the ting, that is, before the parliament, before he could expect them to vote him in as a king. And he had to maintain the happiness of the people, symbolized in his marriage to the ancestral mother goddess, and if he failed, he would be sacrificed. So when we hear about Odin's own trials before he could take up his seat among the gods, we realize that there are many things that are written down as myth, which draws from real life and actual history. So that's it for today. Yeah, have a lovely day.